My name is Emily, and this happened last year in 2023 when I was 16 years old. It was around 6 p.m. on a chilly summer evening when I was hanging out with my boyfriend, Aaron. We decided to meet up with some friends at a local park, but first, we had to stop at my house to grab my skateboard. The park was about a 30-minute walk from my neighborhood, so we figured it would be a nice way to kill time before meeting the others. After grabbing my board, we started making our way toward the park. At the top of the road, there was a school with a main road running alongside it and a small pedestrian tunnel underneath. The tunnel was there so kids and cyclists could safely cross to the other side. We stopped near the tunnel to chat and wait for a text from our friends. As we stood there leaning against the railing, Aaron and I started kissing. But then, out of nowhere, I got this weird feeling, like we were being watched. I stopped and glanced toward the road just in time to see a white car drive past us slowly. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just a coincidence. Over the next 15 minutes, though, the same white car drove by 5 more times. My unease grew with every pass. Aaron noticed my shift in mood and asked what was wrong. I told him about the car and how it seemed to be watching us. He suggested we head to a nearby corner shop before continuing to the park, and I agreed, relieved to leave the area. As we walked, the car drove by again, this time even slower. I turned my head and caught a glimpse of 3 or 4 figures inside, including the driver. The unease I felt earlier turned into outright fear. When I glanced back, I noticed the car had pulled over for a moment before speeding off. Aaron and I decided to pick up the pace, but then I saw a man, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, walking briskly toward us from the direction the car had stopped. He had brown hair and glasses and was closing the distance quickly. My heart pounded as I grabbed Aaron's arm. "Let's head to the shop," I said loudly, hoping the stranger might hear and think twice about following us. Aaron looked confused but went along with it. When we got to the shop, I peeked back and saw the man lingering outside, talking on his phone. A few moments later, the white car drove by again, and he went into the store, looking through the windows before entering. We decided to take a longer route to the park, cutting through some quieter streets and a small graveyard to avoid being followed. As we walked through the graveyard, the white car passed by once more, and the same man appeared again, this time walking behind us. My anxiety spiked when I realized he wasn't alone. 2 more men in black coats were standing ahead of us near the path's exit. One of them had his phone pressed to his ear, while the other was staring straight at us. Aaron and I tried to stay calm, walking past the men as casually as we could. But the moment we passed them, they turned and began following us. The snowballing fear in my chest became unbearable as we cut through a residential area, hoping to lose them in the maze of houses. At one point, we bumped into an older couple walking their dog. Panicking, I blurted out, "Please pretend you know us. Those guys are following us." The couple looked concerned and blocked the men's view of us while we hurried ahead, taking another shortcut. Eventually, we made it to the park, shaken but unharmed. 15 minutes later, as we tried to calm down and explain what had happened to our friends, the white car pulled into the parking lot. Its headlights blared into the park, scanning the area like searchlights. Aaron and I immediately dipped out of sight, hiding behind the skate ramps until the car sped away. To this day, I still don't know what those men wanted or why they followed us so persistently. We didn't report it to the police because we had no solid evidence, and neither of us wanted to involve our families. But the memory still haunts me, especially when I pass that tunnel or see a white car lingering nearby. Whatever their intentions were that night, I'm just grateful we managed to get away. My name is Daniel, and this happened 2 years ago when I was 22. I had just moved to a new city for work, renting a small apartment in a quiet residential area. It wasn't the most exciting place, but it was affordable and close to my office. The neighborhood was a mix of families and retirees, with narrow streets lined by tall hedges and little traffic. One evening in late autumn, I decided to go for a run. The air was crisp, and the setting sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Running had become my way of clearing my mind after a stressful day at work, and I typically took the same route, a loop around the neighborhood that passed through a small park. As I jogged through the park, I noticed a man sitting on a bench near the trail. He was in his 40s, wearing a black jacket and jeans, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. At first, I didn't think much of him. People often sat in the park, enjoying the quiet. But something about the way he watched me as I passed made me uneasy. I picked up my pace, glancing back once I was a safe distance away. The man was still sitting there, his head following me as I moved down the trail. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. When I reached the end of the loop and was heading back toward my apartment, I noticed the same man walking a short distance behind me. My heart sank. He wasn't running, but his pace matched mine, and he seemed to be keeping just close enough to stay in sight. I took a detour down a side street, hoping to lose him, but when I glanced back, he was still there. I started to panic, my breath quickening as I realized I was alone in an unfamiliar area. I didn't want to go straight home and risk leading him to my building, so I decided to head to a nearby convenience store instead. Inside the store, I pretended to browse the shelves, keeping an eye on the door. Sure enough, the man walked past the store, pausing briefly to look inside before continuing down the street. I waited a few minutes before stepping outside, hoping he was gone. The walk back to my apartment felt endless. I took every precaution, changing directions multiple times and sticking to well-lit streets. When I finally reached my building, I glanced around to make sure no one was following me before unlocking the front door. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The next evening, I went for another run, sticking to the main streets to avoid the park. As I turned onto my usual route, I saw the same man standing on the corner, leaning against a lamppost. He wasn't dressed for running or walking, just the same black jacket and jeans. This time, he didn't hide his intent. He watched me openly, his head tilting slightly as I approached. I stopped in my tracks, debating whether to confront him or turn around. Before I could decide, he started walking toward me. My heart raced as I turned and bolted in the opposite direction. I sprinted through the neighborhood, cutting through alleyways and side streets until I was sure I'd lost him. When I got back to my apartment, I double-checked the locks on every door and window. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every creak and shadow. The next morning, I reported the incidents to the local police. They took my statement and promised to send someone to patrol the area, but there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. For the next few weeks, I avoided running altogether, sticking to crowded areas and always staying alert. Just as I was beginning to feel safe again, I found a note taped to my apartment door. It was a single sheet of paper with 3 words scrawled in messy handwriting. "Why do you run?" The note sent a chill down my spine. I called the police immediately, but they couldn't find any fingerprints or clues as to who had left it. My landlord agreed to install a security camera outside my door, and I spent the next few nights sleeping at a friend's place. Eventually, the man stopped showing up. The camera never caught anything suspicious, and the police closed the case. But the experience left a permanent mark on me. To this day, I can't go for a run without looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's still out there, waiting to pick up where he left off. My name is Anna, and this story happened to me 3 years ago when I was 24. At the time, I had just moved into a small apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Minnesota. The winter had been brutal that year, with snow piling up and temperatures consistently below freezing. The apartment complex was modest but cozy, with friendly neighbors and a calm, safe atmosphere. At least that's what I thought. My unit was on the ground floor, and my bedroom window faced the courtyard. I loved waking up to the sight of fresh snow blanketing the area, but the downside was that anyone passing by could see directly into my apartment if the blinds were open. To combat this, I kept them shut most of the time, especially at night. One evening in early January, after a particularly long day at work, I came home, made dinner, and settled on the couch to watch TV. It was snowing heavily outside, and the glow of the streetlights reflected off the drifts, creating a peaceful, almost serene atmosphere. I had just started to relax when I heard it, the faint sound of snow crunching outside my window. At first, I thought it might just be a neighbor walking by, but the sound didn't fade. It lingered, like someone was standing right outside. My heart began to race as I muted the TV and sat perfectly still, listening. The sound stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Summoning my courage, I walked over to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The courtyard was empty, save for the falling snow. I exhaled in relief, convincing myself it had been my imagination. But when I looked down, I saw them, footprints. Fresh ones, leading directly to my window before circling back toward the courtyard. The next morning, I reported the incident to the building manager, who promised to look into it. He told me it was probably just a neighbor cutting through the courtyard or maybe a maintenance worker checking on something. His dismissive tone didn't sit well with me, but I decided to let it go. After all, what else could I do? For the next few nights, everything was quiet. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the footprints meant nothing. But then, a few days later, it happened again. This time, I was lying in bed, reading, when I heard the familiar crunch of snow outside my window. My stomach dropped as I froze, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped directly outside my bedroom. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed a friend who lived in the building. "Can you come over?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think someone's outside my window." My friend arrived within minutes, but by the time we checked the courtyard, the footprints were there again, leading straight to my window, but no one was in sight. The following week, I started noticing other strange things. Small, seemingly insignificant details like my doormat being slightly askew or the trash can outside my door being moved. One night, I found a small piece of paper tucked under my door. It was blank, but its presence was enough to send a chill down my spine. I decided to install a cheap security camera inside my apartment, facing the window. I needed to know if I was imagining things or if someone was truly out there. For a few nights, the footage showed nothing but the courtyard and falling snow. But on the fourth night, I saw him. The grainy footage showed a man in a heavy coat and hood standing outside my window. He didn't move, just stood there, staring into my apartment for what felt like an eternity. Then, as if sensing the camera, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the snow. I took the footage to the police, but they weren't able to identify the man. They suggested I keep the blinds closed and install better locks, which I did immediately. I also shared the footage with the building manager, who promised to increase security around the complex. For a while, things seemed to calm down. Weeks passed without any incidents, and I started to feel safe again. But then, one night in late February, I came home to find a single rose lying on my doorstep. There was no note, no indication of who had left it, but I knew it wasn't a coincidence. That was the final straw. I packed my things and moved out of the apartment a week later, breaking my lease and staying with a friend until I could find a new place. The sense of relief I felt when I left was overwhelming, but the fear stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of those footprints in the snow or the man standing silently outside my window. I'll never know who he was or what he wanted, and maybe that's for the best. Late last year, I made the difficult decision to walk away from a toxic friendship. Sarah and Mike had been in my life for several years. Sarah had a long history of addiction, while Mike struggled with severe mental health issues. For a while, I tried to support them, hoping they'd turn things around, but their behavior grew increasingly erratic and emotionally draining. Every conversation left me feeling worse, as if their problems were slowly consuming me. I knew I had to step away for the sake of my own well-being. The tipping point came when Sarah sent me a series of late-night messages. She said she needed to meet me in person to talk. Something about her tone unsettled me. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. I asked if we could just talk over the phone, but she insisted, becoming increasingly insistent with each message. When I asked what was so urgent, she refused to explain, saying, "You owe me this." Against my better judgment, I agreed. But by the next morning, the nagging feeling in my gut told me I was making a mistake. I texted Sarah to tell her I wouldn't be meeting her and that I thought it was best if we went our separate ways. I told her I wished her well and hoped she'd find the help she needed. Then, I blocked her and Mike on all platforms. I thought that would be the end of it. Couldn't have been more wrong. Within hours, mutual friends began calling and texting me. Sarah had taken screenshots of my message and posted them all over social media, spinning the story to make herself look like the victim. In her version, I was the selfish, heartless friend who abandoned her when she needed me most. Mike joined in, using his own social media accounts to spread false rumors about me. He even posted an old, unflattering photo of me with a caption that implied I was a liar and a manipulator. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a tantrum and they'd move on soon. But the situation escalated quickly. Sarah and Mike started messaging my friends, telling them fabricated stories about me, accusing me of saying cruel things behind their backs, claiming I'd betrayed them. Some friends reached out to ask if what they were saying was true. Others just cut ties without explanation. The worst part was knowing that Sarah and Mike both knew where I lived. Every time I saw an unfamiliar car parked near my apartment or heard a knock at the door, my stomach twisted with anxiety. I started triple-checking the locks on my doors and windows, always on edge, waiting for the next attack. About a week later, things took an even darker turn. I came home from work to find a piece of paper tucked under my doormat. It was blank, but its presence was unsettling. Was it from Sarah or Mike? Was it some kind of message? I couldn't prove it was them, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind, felt amplified. The next day, I reported everything to the police. The officer I spoke to was sympathetic but blunt. "You can file a restraining order," she said, "but it might escalate things. A piece of paper won't physically stop someone." Her words haunted me. I left the police station feeling more vulnerable than ever. I reached out to my landlord and asked if security cameras could be installed around the building. He agreed, but it would take weeks to get them set up. In the meantime, I was on my own. For a brief period, things seemed to quiet down. Sarah stopped posting about me, and Mike faded from view. I started to relax, thinking they'd finally moved on. But just as I began to let my guard down, the nightmare resurfaced. One night, as I was leaving my apartment to grab dinner with a friend, I saw Mike standing at the end of the street. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring. My blood ran cold. I pretended not to notice him and quickly walked to my car, locking the doors the moment I got inside. When I returned home later that evening, I found another note on my door. This time, it wasn't blank. Scrawled across the paper were 3 words: "You'll regret this." I called the police again, showing them the note and explaining what had happened. They advised me to keep all evidence and stay vigilant. The security cameras were finally installed a few days later, and for a while it felt like a weight had been lifted. But the relief was short-lived. A few weeks later, I got a call from one of my coworkers. Sarah had found out where I worked and had been calling the office, pretending to be a client to get information about my schedule. When that didn't work, she left a scathing review online, filled with lies about me. I was mortified, but my boss was understanding and immediately flagged her account. The final straw came when I woke up one morning to find a single rose lying on my doorstep. There was no note this time, but the message was clear. Sarah and Mike weren't going to let this go. I packed my things and moved out of the apartment within a week, breaking my lease and staying with a friend until I found a new place. I changed my phone number, updated my privacy settings, and cut off contact with any mutual acquaintances who might still be connected to Sarah and Mike. The experience left me emotionally drained and constantly on edge, but I knew I had done the right thing by walking away. Even now, months later, I still look over my shoulder when I'm out in public. The fear lingers, a constant reminder of how quickly someone can turn on you. I don't know if Sarah and Mike have moved on or if they're still waiting for their chance to strike again. What I do know is that I'll never ignore the red flags again.